Harry P. Dodge was born in Washington, D.C. in 1919. In 1958, Harry traveled to Europe. From then on, his real passion became the recording of railways, steam and trams in every country he could visit. An able and accomplished cameraman, driven by a deep passion for his subject, Harry P. Dodge has left a unique and incredible record of the great railways of the world.
Throughout Western Europe, the mid-1960s represented the end of the age of steam, and France was not alone in watching her steam locomotives being rapidly replaced by modern electrics and diesel engines. But starting in southern France, Harry Dodge was there to film what he could of the many classes of steam locomotive which still remained. The French have a long tradition of innovation and bold experimentation. This resulted in some of the most highly developed steam locomotives in the world. Sadly, this fine legacy made its final curtain bow just a few years later, in the summer of 1972. With such a fine steam tradition, it was ironic that simple American-built Micados, rather than native compounds, were to be the last French steam to be retired. In 1944, when France was liberated, only 3,000 of the 17,000 pre-war steam engines of the SNCF remained operable. So the French turned to North America for a rapid infusion of simple mixed-traffic locomotives. 1,340 two-cylinder 282s, based on the original US Army light Mikado, were built by American and Canadian manufacturers in less than 2 years. These 141R Liberation class locomotives, as they became known, were less efficient than the well-designed native compounds, but they were readily available, powerful and rugged, and had very low maintenance requirements. By January 1971, when fewer than 100 French-built locomotives remained in service, more than 400 141Rs still worked around the country. Moving next to central France, Harry Dodge discovered some of the mountain and Pacific class locomotives, which were more representative of French steam during its final years. Like most SNCF designs, this 241P class mountain sports high-spoke driving wheels and low running boards. Swept-back lines give it an illusion of continual high speed, and in common with the rest of the big French compounds, it has massive outside low-pressure cylinders. The 241P was a massive locomotive, weighing over 130 tons. Although based on an earlier PLM class, the famous André Chaplin redesigned it for the SNCF, and 35 of the improved engines were built between 1948 and 1952. As the final express passenger class of French steam, they were the culmination of over 120 years of locomotive development. Prior to the withdrawal of the last of the class in May 1970, the 241P was reduced to the humiliation of working only local freights. Liberations operated throughout the entire French network, and it's not surprising that Harry Dodge should have met them again here in the centre of the country. Part of the initial order of the 141Rs did not fare well. 15 locos of this class were lost at sea when the ship sank en route for America. The setback was only temporary. By 1951, when the 141Rs made up just 15% of the active roster, they ran double the average daily mileage of the French classes. They hauled 45% of the total freight tonnage, as well as handling passenger operations. The 231K, seen here pulling a long freight train, was a four-cylinder compound dating from 1909, and the last representative of a proud stable of French Pacifics. To many, the French were the undisputed masters of steam locomotive technology. In the 1920s, André Chapelon showed that by redesigning the exhaust and increasing superheating, the power of existing locomotives could be improved by as much as 50%. For the rest of the steam era, the French locomotive design incorporated these principles. Thus, the SNCF was able to operate highly efficient compound locomotives. The outstanding Chapelon Pacifics, dating from 1929, are considered by many connoisseurs of the steam locomotive to be the finest ever in the history of the Iron Horse. Another 231K, this time on a passenger train. Before the days of the SNCF, 70 of these engines were built for the PLM. 30 were made by Henschel in Germany, and the rest in Paris by Cailles. Moving to the Brittany Peninsula, Harry Dodge found more examples of French steam. The 141C was another Picardy, but of French design. Built between 1921 and 1923, these engines operated throughout the western region. On the Réseau Breton here at Dieppe, 0660 mallets could still be seen shunting in the yards. The mallet was the most common type of articulated locomotive in France and proved to be especially well suited to steep and winding narrow gauge lines. Some of the mallets from Ludeac were later transferred to the Réseau Vivray. Over to the east in Picardy, one of the most famous French trains used to operate between the Channel coast and Paris. It was the Flèche d'Or, the Golden Arrow, the last named train on the SNCF to be hauled by steam. On this occasion, the honor of carrying the distinctive headboard fell to a 231K. The lines of northern France were busy with freight too, and double-headed steam trains were once a common sight along the Somme Valley. White chalk cliffs dominate this busy stretch of coast, where some of the last scenes in the long history of French steam were played out. Already much of the local passenger traffic was handled by diesel rail cars, and just a few years later, they would have the job entirely to themselves. Just a short distance along the coast is Dieppe. The harbour at Dieppe has a major rail terminal which serves the port and also the regular ferry boats bound for England. Just out of the station, an American 141R creeps slowly along the quayside. The French did not have a plentiful supply of coal, so many of their locos were oil burners. The top of the oil tank can be seen above the tender on this end. Powerful diesel locomotives also pull trains from the harbour. This rake is made up of passenger carriages and car transporters. Back to the Flèche d'Or now, and Harry Dodge captures the scene as this famous train prepares to depart from Boulogne. nobody can fully explore France without going to Paris, which is where Harry Dodge completed his tour of the SNCF. The 141TC was the most powerful tank locomotive in France. Built between 1932 and 1938, a fleet of 72 of these 282s worked the suburban lines north of Paris until they were withdrawn in 1970. Paris is the center of the French rail network, and because of its unique geographical position, it could be called the hub of Europe's main railways. Renowned international express trains connect Paris with many other European capitals. They include the Orient Express, the North Express, and the Barcelona Express. So the lines in and around Paris are amongst the busiest in the world. Each summer, additional strain is placed on the system by the mass migration out of the city. Literally millions of passengers are setting out for their annual holidays. The omnipresent liberations were found here too, but most of the shunting work was handled by many French tank locomotives. These powerful engines ranged in size from 210-2s to 060s, and with almost 6,000 stations on the SNCF network, there was always plenty of work for them. Shunting operations of a more complex nature were undertaken in the hump yards, with trucks gliding to their correct track under the force of gravity. Harry's next destination was the Belgian capital, Brussels, a city served by an extensive network of trams. Some steam survived into the 1960s with a number of compound consolidations and Pacifics. But the overhead catenary is already an indication of the dominance of the new electric units. After the war, the Belgian railway system was in a poor state. Physical damage was made worse by the wartime postponement of maintenance. This wholesale destruction was a strong incentive to start the electrification of the railways as soon as possible. The few steam locomotives which remained in the mid-1960s were the last of Belgian steam, making their final appearance before being consigned to the scrapyard. Luxembourg was in a similar situation. Being a tiny country, its steam fleet was never large, but heavy industry still required heavy engines, and a mixture of electric, steam and diesel locomotives handles the country's rail freight. On the passenger side, much of the local demand was met by trams. Denmark was Harry's next destination. Here he found the E-class Pacifics, which were the biggest and best remembered Danish express locomotives. 10 were purchased from Sweden in 1936, and the Danes built 25 more in the mid-1940s. In 1972, 2 of these magnificent engines pulled the funeral train of King Frederick IX and sparked a revival of interest in Danish steam. Steam disappeared early from most Scandinavian main lines, and Denmark, as the first country to employ diesels on a large scale, was no exception. By 1965, only 72 steam locomotives were still active, and all regular steam services on the Dansk Statsbaner ended around 1970. The West German Deutsche Bundesbahn was able to keep its steam locomotives into the 70s, and a number of private narrow-gauge steam railways also survived. At the time of Harry's visit, the decapod was still almost universal, both in East and West Germany. The original Class 50 210 built by Henschel between 1938 and 1944, was the model for the successful wartime austerity class, the Kriegslok. The Class 38 10-wheeler was the oldest engine to survive into the final decade of German steam. Several classes of Pacifics with their high, slender spoke driving wheels powered the fastest German express trains. By the end of the 1960s, only 50 Pacifics remained in service. In the north of the country, the lines around Hamburg often saw diesel and steam engines working side by side. Pacifics, such as this one crossing the River Elbe, were amongst the first modern steam power to be retired. All the important expresses were dieselized. At the same location, we catch a Class 82 010 TAC shunting. The journey down the Rhine from Cologne to Frankfurt is one of the finest in Germany. Many of the towns and villages which line the banks of this great river are served by tramways, but some of the best views are had by following the railways which run along the river valley. The freight trains usually take the east bank of the Rhine, leaving the west bank free for the principal expresses. There's also plenty of boat traffic plying up and down between them. The main lines along the Rhine have long been electrified, but almost every tributary feeding into this great river has its own railway. On many of these, steam lingered on for a few more years. Here at Mainz, the most scenic part of the route is over, but some trains, such as the Rheingold Express, travel the whole length of the river, from the Hook of Holland all the way to Geneva. Further west on the border with France, the yards at Saarbrücken were still busy with steam traffic. Like France, German railways were also strongly attracted by the Pacific type of locomotive for their express passenger trains. The four-cylinder compound Pacific designed by Maffei's Anton Hammel in the early 1900s went through many stages of development. In its day, the great Maffei Pacifics pulled every type of German passenger train, creating the classic image of German express rail travel. Harry paused briefly in Heidelberg, a beautiful town in the Neckar Valley, which still had plenty of trams. Bavaria in southern Germany has always been fiercely independent and kept its railway system separate from the rest for as long as possible. But in the last few decades of steam, all the locomotive types were standardized. Some of the most successful were the Class 50 and Class 44 Kriegslocks. These decapods were both powerful and light and could haul heavy freight trains on almost any line. 10,650 engines of this basic design were built, making them the most numerous steam locomotives in the world. Another brief visit, this time to the city of Würzburg. Kriegslocks were busy working here as well, not surprisingly, for in the few last years of German steam, they made up 2/3 of the remaining locomotives. Harry Dodge completed his tour of Germany in Nuremberg, where bubble cars jostle with trams along the city's ancient streets. Next, Harry Dodge went to Italy, starting with Trieste and Venice on the northern shores of the Adriatic. By the mid-1960s, thanks to an early electrification and modernization program, fewer than 1,000 steam locomotives remained on the roster. The majority of these were made up of moguls and consolidations, and all were of pre-war design. In addition to the trains of the FS, or Italian State Railway, blue and white trams from Austrian days plied the streets and pulled passengers high up into the hills above the sea. Further to the west, Harry found a lot more steam power in Milan. Italy's first railway was opened by the Austrians in 1839. Prior to unification, in 1861, national railway efforts were totally uncoordinated. The Italian network was only finally brought under a single umbrella of the state in 1907. Mainline three-phase electric traction was introduced in Italy before most other countries. Engines were soon converted to DC, and as a result, no new locomotives were built for domestic use after the 1930s. Shunting was handled by 060 and 080 tanks. This 835 class 060 was one of the 12 standard designs adopted by the FS prior to the First World War. Although already ancient, many of these locomotives continued to work into the 1970s, when the FS finally phased out its remaining steam. Italian locomotives are generally very small and are often called bald-looking. They're painted a flat black, and some classes are even considered to be hideous. For all that, the Italians were experts at prolonging the lives of their simple little locomotives. A little further west, in the town of Novara, Harry found some of the FS's fleet of moguls. Another of the original 12 standard FS locomotives was the 600 class 260, a two-cylinder compound designed for mixed traffic. The 625 class, pulling a passenger train through the yards, was a superheated version which made its first appearance in 1910. Although the performance of the FS steam fleet was far from impressive, several important contributions to steam locomotive design were made by the Italians. Most notable were the caprotti valve gear, the Crosti boiler designed to generate extra steam, and the Zara bogie, which carries the front axle and the leading driving axle. The Italians also claim to have come up with the world's first steam turbine locomotive. In the famous town of Pisa, consolidations were found in service until the last years of steam. From 1917 onwards, 393 American-built 280s were supplied to the FS. These 735 class locomotives were free from some of the Italian design flaws. From the running point of view, they were by far the most successful of any of the locomotives ordered by the FS. As early as 1922 FS steam locomotive design practice came to an end. Boilers were inadequate, steam passages were restricted, and the locomotive's performances were lamentable. Amazingly, Italian steam survived as long as anywhere else in Western Europe. In southern cities such as Naples, steam was becoming rare, even at the time of Harry's visit. Electric locomotives had helped to give the FS an early reputation for speed and efficiency. During the fascist government, the national network was improved dramatically. A high-speed direct line was built between Rome and Naples. And whatever his other faults, Mussolini is still widely remembered as the man who got the trains running on time. Despite its ancient civilization, Greece was one of the last European countries to have built railways. 3 different gauges were used. The lines were not connected to the rest of Europe until 1916. One of the first railways in Greece was built as a result of a concession granted to a company called the Piraeus, Athens and Peloponnesus Railway. They were permitted to build a line from Athens and the port of Piraeus over the Corinth Canal into the Peloponnese. It was meter gauge, and by the turn of the century, the railway was 500 miles long. In the 1960s, 260 tank engines were still operating on this system. Number 512 is being turned by hand before taking up her duties. These elderly but elegant tanks were still kept busy in Harry's day and took on much of the freight as well as the obligatory shunting. This light Mikado was one of the MacArthurs, built by Vulcan in the United States and acquired for the Peloponnese meter gauge system after the Second World War. Higher up the mountains, we find number 726, a German consolidation built by Henschel. On these steep lines, the help of a banking engine is often needed. Back at the yards, another 260 tank, number 507, Calamai, takes on water while her sister, number 506, runs round. Meter gauge steam lasted into the 70s, but on the standard gauge, steam was on the way out, and entire classes of old, and in some instances, very new locomotives just disappeared. Only a few classes of mostly Austrian-influenced steam power lingered on. Many of the Hellenic Railway's major depots became graveyards of steam. Instead of being scrapped, large numbers of locomotives were left where they had worked and stood slowly rusting until they were even too derelict to remove. Further east in Istanbul, the ancient capital of European Turkey, Harry Dodge found a city blanketed by snow. Here, steam was still very much in favor, and German Kriegslock decapods operated in large numbers. Approximately 1/3 of Turkey's locomotives came from Germany, with similar consignments from Britain and the United States. Palma, the capital of the Balearic island of Majorca, was where Harry Dodge embarked on his first Spanish railway. Two separate railway companies have stations in Plaza España. A narrow gauge line runs to the town of Inca, as well as a single track line which runs for 17 miles through the mountains to Soler. Although Majorca once had its own locomotive works, steam disappeared from the island's railways at a very early stage. Electric trains were introduced to these narrow gauge lines in 1912. The same elderly locomotives operate today, pulling locals and tourists out of the city and up into the mountains. There are 13 tunnels on the route to Solaire. The longest is almost 2 miles long. It takes 6 minutes to go through. Before the train reaches its destination, a stop is made to allow the passengers to alight and take photographs of the valley of Solaire and the peak of Puigmajor. Then the train winds its way down to the tiny railway station at the end of the line. On the northwestern side of the island is the beautiful fishing port of Puerto de Solaire. When Harry Dodge was there, the bay had already been heavily developed as a resort. The town's bright red trams continue to serve local passengers as well as the many visitors. The wooden tram cars were reputedly imported from San Francisco early this century, and they run for 3 miles through the orange groves and up to the inland town of Solaire. Solaire is one of Majorca's most beautiful towns. In addition to narrow streets and medieval buildings, it claims to be the birthplace of Columbus. Here on the mainland at Tarragona, the Spanish broad gauge lines still operate almost 3,000 steam locomotives. The gauge of 5 foot 6 inches was supposedly influenced by Brunel's preference for a wider gauge than the standard 4 foot 8.5. As a result, Spain had some of the largest steam locomotives in Europe, with all its 3 major classes exceeding 200 tons. Perhaps the most distinctive locomotives ever designed anywhere were the Bear Garretts. The boiler was slung between two engine trucks to give maximum tractive effort and minimum axle weight. The fuel and water bunkers were supported by the engine trucks, and the result was the ultimate in articulated tank engines. Several European countries experimented with Garretts, but only England and Spain retained them in regular service. The Spanish ones were by far the best known and the longest lived in Europe. Of the 15 big 2882s, the 10 built in 1960 and 61 were the last new steam engines to be built for domestic use in Europe. All were retired by the end of the decade, and by 1973, all steam had disappeared from the Spanish RENFE. Further south in Alicante, Harry Dodge caught the sight of one of the big, handsome Micados, Class 141F. 242 of these general-purpose locomotives were built between 1952 and 1960. The violent upheaval of the Spanish Civil War, which wrecked the country throughout the second half of the 1930s, proved to be a mixed blessing for steam. Modernization of the devastated railways was further delayed by the Second World War, and the steam engine continued as the mainstay of the RENFE for another 20 years. Still in southern Spain, near the city of Granada, Harry Dodge discovered a salt works where the motive power was even older than steam. Burrow traction, or donkey power, was used to pull the laden trucks and to operate the cable-worked incline which carried the loads up onto the massive hills of salt. Harry Dodge's last European country was Portugal, where the Companhia de Caminhos de Ferro Portugueses ran another broad gauge railway system. In 1968, the CP was a living museum with most of its motive power having been built prior to World War I, all of it immaculately maintained. Although diesels handled most of the traffic, it was here, in the mountains and river valleys of northern Portugal, that Portuguese steam made its last stand. Henschel Pacifics, Baltic tanks, 10-wheelers and Micados were all working between Salamanca and the Spanish border. They were complemented by the locomotives of the 4 narrow-gauge lines which branch off the Douro Valley. One of the meter gauge lines joining the broad gauge of the Douro Valley is based at Regur. Here, Harry watched a 280 tank number E132 as she pulled into the station. Portuguese steam was certainly varied. Narrow gauge alone used 14 different classes with 7 wheel arrangements. Operating on both the meter gauge, Corgo and Sabor lines were several Mallet compound tanks, all built by Henschel of Kassel in Germany. The older Mallets were of 0440 wheel arrangements and date from 1905. But in 1911, a much larger variety was introduced with an unusual 2460 wheel arrangement. Number 114, a Kessler 260 tank built in 1886, was one of the CP's oldest working locomotives, while behind it number 142, a more modern 282 tank engine, pulls into the yards. This scene of narrow-gauge suburban traffic was typical of the busy Tamega line, with numbers 114 and 142 jostling for their share of the passengers. number 213, an unusual 2460 mallet dating from 1923, brings us to the end of Harry Dodge's unique excursion. A fitting tribute to the last years of European steam. If you have enjoyed this program, then there's plenty more steam around the world in the 4 other programs which make up the rest of this series. We start with Africa, where rails all the way from Cape to Cairo was once the dream of Victorian pioneer Cecil Rhodes. In 1965 and 1970, Harry Dodge visited and recorded what is left of this incredible legacy. Throughout Central and Southern Africa, the uncompromising terrain spawned some spectacular feats of engineering. Many of these, including the famous Victoria Falls Bridge, are recorded when huge fleets of garrets were still ruling supreme. The East African Railway, Benguela Railway, Malawi Railway, Rhodesian Railways, and Franco-Ethiopian Railways are all featured, as well as the steam trains of South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and the Sudan. In the next program, Harry Dodge has captured the incredible variety of Asian steam, commencing in India with Bengali broad and narrow gauge lines. We visit the exquisite Darjeeling Railway, which is considered by many to be the world's finest, while Jaipur's meter gauge system contrasts with other locomotives ranging from huge Pacifics to tiny 2-foot tanks. Wider afield, there is Japanese preserved steam, the wood-burning locos of Thailand, Indonesian tank engines, and Malaysian light steam. While in Australia and New Zealand, we find an equally delightful assortment of gauges and rolling stock. Latin America. This program, filmed between 1962 and 1971, features an amazing variety of Latin American steam, including garrets in the high Bolivian desert and narrow gauge through the Guatemalan jungle, with everything from 210-2s to 040s. Linked by a dramatic journey over the Andes Mountains, Harry Dodge has captured the locomotives of a whole continent. Brazil's Leopoldina Railway, the rope-hauled Serra Inclines, British locomotives in Argentina, the Antofagasta and Bolivia Railway, the incredible railways of southern and central Peru, one of the 7 wonders of the railway world, as well as railway scenes from El Salvador and Mexico. In the 1960s, Harry Dodge travelled behind the Iron Curtain to capture the railways of a bygone age, before the collapse of communism and the demise of steam. With smoke belching forth across every state, this program explores the unique record he left behind, with rare footage from Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, Romania and Czechoslovakia. Steam, freight and passenger trains are included, as well as tank engines and turntables, and everything from mighty 210Os to tiny narrow-gauge locos, not to forget all the activity behind the scenes.